clear what the spatial distribution is, how controllable it is, and whether or not there might be regional scale weather disruption.
Hello, everybody. This is Andy Revkin, the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm trying something new here. There's a live briefing from the National Academies team that has produced a new report on geoengineering, governance issues, and research priorities. And I'm going to show it to you live and do some commentary. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Field, who's the committee chair for this committee report. They're about a couple of minutes in, but you can watch here and weigh in with comments and questions in the text box.
The three main technologies is
and let me know if you
computer
can't hear it.
On the potential of changing the properties of high elevation clouds to alter global temperature are conflicting, with some results indicating real potential and other results indicating that it's unlikely to work. So very preliminary, but worthy of future study. Next slide. Let me say just a few things about the conclusions that set up the program. So after looking at the literature, it's really clear that a successful program really needs to integrate physical, social, and ethical research dimensions, that the key questions that need to be answered have dimensions that are in the natural sciences and engineering spaces, but they also have key dimensions that are in the social sciences and ethical dimensions, and that focusing on one aspect or another is likely to lead to distorted conclusions and won't provide the critical information that's necessary. It's also necessary that these different research threads proceed in parallel so that each can inform the others. Next slide. There has been some research on solar geoengineering at the scale of a few $1 million a year globally, but the current state of understanding is limited and fragmented with substantial knowledge gaps. And it's really clear that the information that's available to date does not provide a sufficient basis for supporting informed decisions. Next slide. It's also clear that currently we don't have anything like a coordinated or systematic governance of solar geoengineering research. And that's really important for moving forward. There are, in contrast, a number of other international issues for which the context provides a good opportunity for learning and adopting best principles for the development of a solar geoengineering research governance landscape. Next slide. When we look at what kinds of research will be most useful for the near term, the focus should be on better characterizing and reducing uncertainties concerning the risks of deployment, and that the next opportunities really come in the space of new knowledge to inform decision makers. But it's important to recognize that this isn't a topic where one additional experiment or 100 additional experiments are likely to tamp the level of uncertainty down to being trivial or unimportant. And in the future, we're going to have to continue to think about a pathway that allows us to make important decisions under uncertainty, recognizing that there are limits to how much it can be reduced. Next slide. And in order to make the most progress possible in reducing uncertainty, it's important to have a research program that really links perspectives across disciplines, across geographic regions, and across perspectives. That's important not only for the essential knowledge to be gained, but also to build trust and legitimacy. And then finally, it's important to recognize that any research endeavor is going to have important path dependencies, and we need to remember at the outset that if we're trying to create an environment that is supportive of good decision making, that we have to pay attention to the issues of transparency, openness, trust, and legitimacy from the outset. Okay, I want to turn now to two recommendations from the programmatic perspective that sort of frame where we think this enterprise should go. Next slide. First of all, the committee recommends that the U.S. should implement a robust portfolio of climate mitigation and adaptation. That has to be the top priority, not solar geoengineering. But in addition, given the urgency of climate change concerns and the need for a full understanding of a possible response options, the U.S. should establish, in coordination with other countries, a transdisciplinary solar geoengineering research program. In follow-on remarks, you'll hear more about what that program should look like, but the focus should be on developing policy-relevant knowledge rather than advancing a path to deployment, and the research should be designed such that if the findings indicate that deployment is not feasible, desirable, or practical from either a science engineering perspective or from a social feasibility perspective, there should be paths for terminating the research and not proceeding further. Next slide. We see the overall research enterprise as representing a tightly interacted, coordinated process that involves not only the research moving forward, but also governance and engagement moving forward in parallel to get the best possible answers to the research questions, and also to build the social license that would be required for making any kind of decision. And critical to this is the idea that if it turns out that the research indicates that particular options are not feasible or not attractive, there should be pathways for exiting the research program and terminating the studies, as well as for building them up in areas that do turn out to be attractive. A final recommendation that I want to discuss concerns coordination of the program. Next slide. And currently in the United States, the global change research is coordinated through the U.S. Global Change Research Program. This same program should be tasked to provide coordination and transparent oversight of the solar geoengineering research program, and that should include coordination across agencies, fostering interdisciplinary components, ensuring rigorous peer review, maintaining an active database, periodically assessing progress. The solar geoengineering program needs to be carefully coordinated, and it needs to be subject to careful management, careful governance, and careful oversight. And let me turn now to comments on the research governance, and those will be provided by my colleague, Al Lin.
Thank you, Chris. As noted on a previous slide, there currently is no coordinated governance of solar geoengineering research. Laws developed in other contexts, such as the National Environmental Policy Act and the Clean Air Act, may apply to some experiments. However, these laws, which tend to focus on physical impacts, would not necessarily be triggered by research activities, even outdoor experiments. An earlier slide highlighted the need to take an integrated and evolving approach to research and governance of research. In our deliberations, we explored research governance mechanisms at international, national, and subnational scales, taking a broad understanding of what governance might include and the objectives it should serve. Governance encompasses not only domestic statutes, tort laws, and international treaties, but also codes of conduct, information registries, and other mechanisms. Our governance recommendations are directed to a wide range of stakeholders in solar geoengineering research, including funders of research, science agencies, national governments, international bodies, and researchers themselves. We crafted our recommendations to address risks of research, build public confidence in the research process and research outcomes, and help ensure that research in appropriate areas gets done. Next slide, please. With respect to governance, our chief recommendation is that a U.S. national research program should operate under robust research governance and support the eventual development or designation of international governance mechanisms. What might robust research governance look like? In recommendation 5.1, we call for a number of governance mechanisms to promote information sharing and coordination of research while fostering transparency, public engagement, and risk and impact assessment. While the committee envisions that these recommendations would be acted upon in their totality, any of them individually is worth pursuing. We don't have time here to cover all the recommended governance mechanisms in detail, but I'd like to discuss several recommendations to provide a sense of them. Next slide, please. One set of recommendations calls for solar geoengineering researchers to adhere to a code of conduct and for funders of research to require adherence to a code of conduct as a condition of funding. Although principles for solar geoengineering research and the code of conduct have been proposed, at present there is no formally sanctioned or widely adopted code. Our recommendation spells out what we expect researchers to commit to in a code of conduct, including protecting the scientific quality of the research, assessing potential adverse effects, avoiding atmospheric experiments with detectable climate or other environmental effects, making research activities and results public, and providing for suitable levels of public and stakeholder participation and engagement. Another set of recommendations involves assessments, reviews, and permitting. For outdoor solar geoengineering atmospheric experiments, we recommend the establishment of a permitting requirement which would incorporate impact assessment and public notice requirements. Next slide, please. Assessments and reviews should not be limited to the level of individual experimentation. They also should be done at a programmatic level to consider the cumulative developmental trajectory of solar geoengineering research activities. Accordingly, we recommend that any country engaged in solar geoengineering research establish a standing advisory body composed of experts from a range of disciplines and representatives of potentially affected communities. Such a body would recommend policies and practices on research and research governance. We further recommend the preparation of regular programmatic assessments that collectively assess the health, environmental, and social impact of all solar geoengineering research activities that a country sponsors or approves, and any research program it adopts. Such assessments should incorporate broad and meaningful public engagement and protocols for public engagement. On the matter of public engagement, the committee is of the view that broad and diverse participation and engagement are essential if solar geoengineering research is to be viewed as legitimate, useful, and deserving of public support. It can help avoid the perception that solar geoengineering could be developed by one party or a small number of parties without
This point that he's making now is important, and the current plan to do a Swedish deployment of a tiny experiment is facing some pushback because of assertions of not complete transparency and engagement, including with indigenous peoples in Sweden.
Adopted at subnational, national, or international levels. At the international level, the committee noted the likely challenges of achieving multilateral consensus on solar geoengineering, as well as the tendency for global agreements to evolve after domestic standards have been established. Although governance mechanisms are more likely to be first adopted domestically, various steps can occur now at the international level. One of our recommendations in this area is that funders of solar geoengineering research should promote international cooperation, including with participants from the Global South, within research teams by giving priority to research efforts that include substantial international membership or institutional cooperation. Next slide, please. Before turning things over to Kate, I'd like to highlight one other recommendation which pertains specifically to outdoor experiments that involve releasing substances into the atmosphere. We recommend that such experiments be considered only when they can provide critical observations not already available or likely to become available through laboratory studies, modeling, and experiments of opportunity. Outdoor experiments involving the release of substances into the atmosphere should be subject to governance, including the impact assessment, permitting system, and public engagement I've highlighted. In addition, any outdoor substance releases should be limited to a quantity of material at least 2 orders of magnitude smaller than that which could cause detectable changes in global mean temperature or adverse environmental effects. Kate will now discuss our recommendations regarding the research agenda.
Thank you, Al. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you an introductory overview now of the research agenda we proposed. Rather than organizing a research agenda around disciplinary fields of study, we proposed 13 clusters of interdisciplinary research questions that target decision-relevant uncertainties. There are considerable linkages and overlaps among these clusters. They shouldn't be viewed as isolated silos of research. To make it easier to grasp the diverse array of topics, we've grouped them into 3 broad categories. The first, context and goals for solar geoengineering research, is an atypical category in that it focuses on research which will improve the solar geoengineering research enterprise itself. It thus underlies how all the research in this overall agenda will be approached. There are 4 clusters under this category which identify research questions about program development pathways, future conditions, integrated decision analysis, and capacity building. The second broad category, impacts and technical dimensions, includes 5 clusters, which we identify research questions about atmospheric processes, climate response, other impacts of solar geoengineering, monitoring and attribution, and technology development and assessment. Finally, the third category, social dimensions, includes 4 clusters, which identify research questions about public perceptions and engagement, political and economic dynamics, governance, and ethics. I'm going to walk through a couple of examples of research clusters from each category now. Next slide, please. So for example, under context and goals, we have a research cluster on program development pathways. This is recognizing that there are important researchable questions still about how to conduct solar geoengineering research. The committee envisions significant roles for example, social scientists who study science policy here, STS scholars, and some example research questions that would be conducted under this cluster include how and by whom would decisions be made to abandon a solar geoengineering research program or to proceed with further development and deployment? How and by whom are the scientific questions identified? Next slide, please. This, another example in this category, research cluster 3 is on integrated decision analysis. This is recognizing this principal goal of solar geoengineering research as characterizing and reducing uncertainty. So this cluster focuses on questions about how to address decision-relevant uncertainties about solar geoengineering in a holistic way. We envision roles for disciplines such as risk analysis, integrated assessment modeling, and decision theory here, with research activities such as the development of more empirically parameterized models of the relationship between climate variables and socioeconomic outcomes to, for example, support integrated assessment modeling-based analyses, or the advancement of application of methods for decision-making under deep uncertainty to solar geoengineering. Next slide, please. Okay, in the area of impacts and technical dimensions, the atmospheric processes cluster focuses on questions around the chemical and physical processes that produce the radiative effects of solar geoengineering. This cluster would include research activities ranging from higher resolution simulations to observational, laboratory, and potentially outdoor experiments. The activities occurring in this cluster will differ considerably by the type of solar geoengineering. So for example, for stratospheric aerosol injection, the type of research questions that might be addressed here include what is the rate of formation and growth of particles? with different injection schemes? How would the wake of aircraft affect plume dispersal? And for marine cloud brightening, it might include questions such as, what are the interactions between injected aerosols and clouds? How much brightening will result? How long will the brightening persist? And the like. Next slide, please. This is a research cluster on other impacts, cluster 7. It focuses on assessment of environmental and societal impacts of solar geoengineering proposals. The committee envisions a broad range of disciplines that would be involved with this research, the same ones that currently conduct climate impacts assessment, ranging from ecology to economics. Some research needs that we've identified include the development of detailed understanding of solar geoengineering's effects on a broader range of climatic and biogeochemical variables and on socio-ecological systems, empirical studies of possible economic impacts of solar geoengineering, and downscaling of simulations for impacts assessment. Next slide, please. Okay, in the social dimensions category, research cluster 10 focuses on public perception.
This is the National Academy of Sciences report committee briefing on their report on blocking sunlight as a climate warming mitigation strategy. Earlier, they made the point in all caps repeatedly that mitigation of emissions comes first. But the report authors, in a consensus here, do say that research on mitigating incoming energy through solar radiation management deserves research. And they have a whole menu of recommendations on how to carry that out. Transparency, inclusion, and lots of other provisos, but they're definitely saying there's a role for this if you want to limit warming on a planet on which emissions of greenhouse gases so far have not been mitigated after decades of trying. Back to the committee. This is Kate from UC San Diego.
Research such as which values and principles should guide field experiments, questions on governance such as what ethical principles should guide governance of potential deployment, and ethical questions about deployment, management, monitoring, and determination. Next slide, please. Okay, with that, I'll turn things back to Chris Field.
Thank you, Kate. Now,
Chris Field heads the Stanford Woods Institute on the Environment. He's a longtime climate researcher and a lead author of past IPCC reports.
consistent with our emphasis on maintaining the focus on decarbonization, it's important to have a budget that doesn't pull resources away from those key concerns. It's also important to have a budget that doesn't increase concerns about putting us on a slippery slope to deployment, or a budget that doesn't inadvertently take attention away from decarbonization.
That's the moral hazard question that folks like Bill McKibben have raised often. If we do this, it will take away, it will feel like an out clause and take people away from the harder work of mitigating emissions.
$200 million cumulatively. This represents a small slice of the non-satellite global change research budget, something on the order of 2 to 4%, but it also represents a big uptick, a several-fold increase in the total amount of money that's going into solar geoengineering research, consistent not only with the importance of the questions, but with the existing capacity of the research community to take advantage of that kind of funding.
Chris is making the point here that the budget here, even at $100 million a year, is like 2% of the overall budget for analyzing and mitigating climate change.
All the way to the social science and ethical components in the most integrated way possible if we're to achieve full benefits. Some aspects of this research are, however, more expensive than others, and that includes major field campaigns involving aircraft or ships or lots of individuals who need to be deployed to remote locations. And the budget should be structured to accommodate those kinds of major field campaigns. It's also important to recognize that there's a lot we don't know about what directions the research is going to go. And in response to that, we need to allocate part of the budget to be distributed dynamically based on what we learn in other parts of the program. And then a final component that's really critical for structuring the budget is that the budget structure needs to include support for the governance parts and the public engagement parts from the start. They can't be viewed as afterthoughts or add-ons. That's illustrated in the next slide, where you can see that in addition to the 3 core investments in context and goals, social dimensions, and impacts and technical dimensions, there should be a substantial part of the budget that's dynamically allocated based on the emerging evidence of where the greatest needs are. And there should be a substantial part of the budget that's allocated to oversight, management, governance, and public engagement.
That's an important point. Emergent research on emergent ideas has to have a significant component related to flexibility and adaptability of the work itself and its directionality.
Bring to the front of the line, and it's not to advocate for deployment of solar and geoengineering. It's really to figure out whether or not further consideration of solar geoengineering ought to be part of the portfolio of response strategies. The recommendations that we're making are recommendations for an initial exploratory phase of a research program. Over the longer term, the program might expand or might contract, and it might lead to big new efforts, or it might be terminated. We put a lot of emphasis on addressing feasibility, but it's important to remember that when we talk about feasibility, we mean not only technical feasibility, but also social feasibility, acceptance, buy-in, support, the kinds of public issues that are as likely to control whether or not any of these technologies are practical as any of the science or engineering efforts. And let me finally just close with a comment that the committee has really tackled this problem from the perspective that the idea should be that as additional information becomes available, if solar geoengineering continues to look promising, there should be further investment and development. If the evidence indicates that it's not promising, or that there are technical, social, even philosophical challenges that can't be overcome, then the research process needs to be open to terminating the effort. It's really an investment in developing decision-relevant science and not in advocating for any particular outcome. With that, I want to thank you for your attention, and we look forward to your questions. The next slide provides information on getting the report.
Great, thank you all so much for that presentation. At this point, we are going to open it up to questions from the audience. So as a reminder, to ask a question, just type it into the box below your video player. The first question I want to ask is, what about this moment do you think makes it the right time for the academies to provide updated recommendations on solar geoengineering research and governance?
I'll start with just a couple of quick comments. And I think as we started out, it's really a time of a critical juncture in our tackling of climate change. We're not making the progress we should. We're seeing a renewed focus on climate change responses, climate change solutions. And I think it's important for everyone to have access to the best available information about which solutions options are promising, which ones aren't, and where we can head in the future. We're far from ready to see any kind of recommendations about solar geoengineering, and the research endeavor that we're proposing over 5 years will begin to provide some of the key pieces of information, but it's really too early to say whether or not we're likely to see sufficient information after 5 years to be able to make clear decisions one way or the other.
Great, thank you, Chris. Our next question is, are any other countries looking seriously at solar geoengineering at this point? Are the concerns and interests of other countries similar to those identified in this new report for the US, or are they notably different in some ways?
There are a number of committee members who were really focused on the international landscape. And I would encourage one of them to make a comment at this point. Peter Frumhoff, would you like to comment on the international agenda?
Sure. Hi, everybody. So there certainly are other countries, China and others, that have been doing some initial exploration researchers in other countries. And we sought input from both researchers and civil society perspectives from other nations in the developing of our recommendations. I think where we landed, as Chris and others highlighted, was to make sure that the report itself, while focused on a U.S. research program, was intentional in making recommendations about international coordination and the development of international collaboration in research, as well as the design of international governance mechanisms. We're not in a position to obviously design what a program in another country should look like. We certainly think that many of the recommendations, for example, about codes of conduct, about registries for research, permitting processes, and so on, could be adopted at national levels in other nations. And I believe that there'll be conversations taking place beyond the release of this report, for example, with other national academies in other countries, to explore whether these recommendations might be suitable for consideration by relevant bodies in other nations.
And during the development of the report, we made an intensive investment in soliciting perspectives from other countries. I might ask Ambuj Sagar, who's a committee member from India, to speak to the perspectives on solar geoengineering about a US-led program from an international perspective.
Thank you, Chris. So I would actually think, before I even get to that, I think I do want to highlight that while there are some countries that have research programs in solar geoengineering, there are many who do not. And given the nature of this issue, which is obviously going to be global in perspective, it is important for other countries to start thinking about at least engaging with this question in some way, and hopefully this report will catalyze that kind of a effort. In terms of coordinating with the US-led effort, I think the report does talk about the fact that it, in some sense, that it is a kind of a coordinated process where decision making really, in some senses, is intended to be shared, and therefore, while we are saying that the process is US-led, it's certainly the way we are envisaging it would involve, and I think for a country like India, I could very well imagine.
So hi, this is Andy Revkin at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. I'm showing you a live stream of the National Academies of Science report briefing on their new report on blocking sunlight as a path to limiting global warming. Over and over, they stress that these are a set of technologies and possibilities that are only at the stage of research, with an enormous amount of work to be done, including governance issues, consideration of ethical issues, legal issues. Several of the authors are law professors. On Friday, I'll be holding a close focus deeper dive with these authors, with Chris Field, who's from Stanford, and with several independent scientists and experts, including Mike Gerard from Columbia's Law Center, Sabin Law Center on Climate Change Law, and with David Keith from Harvard, who's furthest along in initiating a very modest initial test of some of the technologies over Sweden as early as this summer. Back to the briefing.
It's a research that's already ongoing. Might start with Doug McMartin.
Thanks, Chris. So I would say overall, the level of funding to date is relatively small, so measured in millions of dollars per year. And most of that has, in fact, virtually all of that has been modeling type work. And so there are certainly some researchers in the field who are interested in conducting field experiments. And so that's sort of, in some sense, a motivator for saying we need to start thinking about how to do get the governance in place. So I don't think it's the horse has left the barn at all. And I'll also point out that there have already been discussions among the research community about codes of conduct. There hasn't been anything formally adopted, but those discussions have already started and there are draft codes of conduct available. So I think this would simply add and start thinking about how one might make sure that the governance is in place for, to the extent that there's any external outdoor research that's being conducted.
And I might ask Lisa Dilling to comment on the social science perspective on implications of research that's already ongoing.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think there has been quite a lot of social science research and ethical research, research and ethics in this topic. And so far it has been ad hoc and on individual bases, but I think that this is a welcome movement, I think, towards trying to bring together that research in more close coordination with other kinds of research, like the physical research, physical science research that's been going on. But there has been over a decade, 15 years or so of research looking at public perceptions in solar geoengineering, for example, and looking at not only perceptions of deployment, but actually the research itself. And there's been quite a lot of acceleration of that research, I would say, in the last few years. So I would think that this would be, this is a good basis from which to go forward on a larger program.
Thank you.
Thank you both. That's a nice lead into our next question, which asks about one particular ethical concern, specifically the concern that the maturation of solar geoengineering will provide mankind with an out from having to reduce our carbon emissions. Could the panel talk a little bit more about what the report says on this point?
Let me just start by commenting that we had really extensive discussions about thinking how to design a program that doesn't create an out, that doesn't deter mitigation. But it is a complicated ethical issue. And maybe our philosopher, Marian Hordican, would like to speak to the way she sees the ethical issues sorting out.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to this question. I mean, this idea of mitigation, deterrence, or moral hazard has been a really significant concern ever since people started talking about and researching solar geoengineering, and I think it continues to be a concern. There has been some social science research trying to figure out whether research on solar geoengineering is likely to deter investment in mitigation and sort of public focus and policy focus on mitigation. I think the jury's sort of still out, but it's also the case that what we do now will shape whether mitigation deterrence happens or not. And so I think one of the, just to underscore something that Chris said, I think one of the important efforts in the program design is to really think about how important it is to continue to foreground mitigation and adaptation, to move cautiously in terms of the level of financial investment in this research, and then also to really engage in a research program that's subject to ongoing assessment, diverse public and stakeholder engagement, and that researches other strategies sort of iteratively as we move forward that can safeguard against mitigation deterrence. So I think part of our work, part of the work of the research program will be to continue to think about how program design can be refined in ways that ensure that decarbonization remains central.
This is such an important issue that I would encourage any other committee members who'd like to speak to it to make a quick comment. but that was also a great answer. So maybe we can go on.
Thank you all. Our next question is in a similar vein. The history of weather and climate intervention includes many examples of military involvement. So can we assume that future research on this topic will be transparent and public when in the past it has not been?
When we talk about developing a program that assesses technical feasibility as well as social feasibility, we're working from the starting position that openness and transparency and engagement are going to be key enablers. You know, I would say that the committee perspective has come from the orientation that a secret program is unlikely to be successful, because even if it does figure out some of the technical aspects, we won't have access to figuring out what social conditions would be absolutely fundamental to being able to deploy a program like this. So in any kind of a rational world, the role for hidden research, for confidential research, should be really, really limited. And we hope that in establishing a program that's open and transparent, the value of this kind of approach is rapidly revealed. I don't know if anybody else from the committee would like to weigh in on this one. An important issue.
Lisa, I think you have your hand up. You can go ahead if you have something you'd like to add.
Oh, sure. And I see Al had his hand up first if he wants to go.
Go ahead, Lisa. And I'll chime in.
I was just going to emphasize what Chris said, but also to say again, to return to the important piece, the equally important part of this report is about governance mechanisms. I think that's what Al's going to speak to. He was the lead on that, or one of the leads on that chapter. But the question of military, the military research in this area, we didn't deal specifically with that, but our whole recommendation and governance rests on transparency and public engagement of being completely open about the kinds of research that are going forward. And I'm not an expert in this, but my guess is that the military control of this would be not conducive to a transparent research program. So that's we really have this as a fundamental building block of our governance mechanisms, is to be transparent.
Yes, and what I would add is that, some of the specific governance mechanisms, in addition to the ones that I already mentioned earlier, include, establishment of a research registry where researchers would be expected to, make their experiments as well as their ultimate data and findings available, on that registry, as well as other mechanisms that we recommend for transparency. And that the fact that these recommendations are aimed towards not just, let's say, the government, but to the researchers themselves, to funders of researchers, et cetera, I think would help to ensure that transparency would be promoted.
Thanks.
Thank you both. What are the environmental justice issues associated with solar geoengineering? And were any of the identified research needs in your report related to environmental justice?
Really, really important issue. And of course, the environmental justice components have numerous dimensions. They range from the important dimension of which communities are most susceptible, vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and which benefit most from limiting climate change. They have elements that are related to decision-making about paths forward and enabling voices from across the spectrum to play a role in the decision-making, to the possibility that some of these geoengineering technologies might specifically disadvantage areas where people are already vulnerable. And a lot of the emphasis on the design of the research program is to make sure that there are pathways for hearing from diverse communities around the world communities that can express, their preferences about the design of the research, the goals of the research, the prioritization of different kinds of outcomes. And those issues need to be integrated into a big picture that also includes the natural science and engineering components. I don't think there's a way to address the environmental justice issues without listening to vulnerable communities around the world, and it'll be a critical part of the research moving forward.
And Lisa, go ahead.
I would just add to that we also did discuss the need to broaden the suite of researchers engaged in this type of research. It has tended to be global north researchers that have been involved in this research, and perhaps my colleague Ambush will speak to this as well. But that was a component of environmental justice that we felt was really important to discuss in the report, which is who is doing this research, and to be broadening that group of researchers.
Yeah, and if I may add to
Just briefly, this is a simulcast of the National Academies report on solar geoengineering, blocking sunlight to limit warming. Currently talking about the justice questions.
and how to engage with them. And so we've explicitly kind of talked about that in the report, both about the importance of capacity for as part of the research of this building a robust research program, but also capacity itself as a topic of research to better understand the kinds and the dimensions of capacity that might be needed in order for disadvantaged communities and across the world and developing countries and so on to be able to engage with this kind of issue. And to me, at least, I think the capacity question really goes to the heart of how to get how to have a more just outcome in the environmental domain.
Thank you. Why don't we take one more question?
That's great. Yeah, we are getting close to time. Our last question today is, what do you want people working in climate change research or working on solar geoengineering research now, the full spectrum of intersecting disciplines that touch this issue? What are you hoping that these people take away from your report as they read it and talk to you and hear from you more as a committee over the next few weeks?
That's a really great question. So often we think about National Academies reports as being targeted primarily at the funders or at the agencies that might implement the programs. But what we really hope is that the research community begins to think broadly about these issues and integrates questions about solar geoengineering into their own thinking. We also really see the transdisciplinary model that we're proposing as being foundational for all kinds of climate-related science moving forward, and that until we really understand the climate issue as one that involves ecosystems, economies, communities, and vulnerable people around the world, we're not going to be making the kind of progress we should. So hopefully this report will be an inducement to think broadly and ambitiously about climate change solutions, but also to think broadly and ambitiously about the design and structure of future research programs. We're a little bit over time. It's been a real pleasure to work on this topic that's so important and has the potential to really change the way the world works. I had a unique pleasure to work with just an amazing committee and an amazing National Academies team on this. So thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you all so much for tuning in with us today. And thank you to the committee for their presentation. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing more from you over the next couple of weeks. So thank you for your time.
So that was an interesting briefing on a new report from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine on using blocking sunlight as a counterweight to global warming from rising emissions of greenhouse gases. I'm Andy Revkin, the Earth Institute of Columbia University, streaming it here as a public service and ahead of our session we're going to hold tomorrow with one of the authors, Chris Field, and with several of the key players in this arena. David Keith at Harvard, whose work is currently heading toward a field test, a tiny field test, a couple of pounds of substance that might be released over Sweden. There are lots of issues that this report raises about the importance of early inclusion. The counterweight there is, how do you get anything done in a world of competing interests? Even on the questions that were raised around environmental justice, there are conflicting arguments. There's the environmental justice of limiting or worst case warming right now in areas that are overheating. There's the environmental justice. The Sami in Sweden are stating the case that they haven't been consulted in that Harvard work that's might be playing out there this summer. So there's lots to consider here going forward. And I hope you'll join me on Friday to take a deeper dive with one of the authors. And I'll show you a slide that tells you what's going to be happening right here. It's David Keith, Chris Field, Mike Gerard, who's the Columbia University Sabin Climate Change Law Center director, founder, and who's an author of a book on climate engineering and the law. Holly Jean Buck from University at Buffalo, who has written a book on after geoengineering, kind of a look ahead at how this can play out. David Keith, as I said, from Harvard, and Marissa Sanger, who's a young researcher with a background in the Bay Area Sunrise Movement, who's now working with David Keith and has a very strong focus on the moral argument for testing geoengineering as an alternative, not an alternative, but as a backstop and a supplement to what we might do with cutting emissions of greenhouse gases. Again, this is Andy Revkin, the Earth Institute of Columbia University. Sustain What webcast. I just threw this one together very quickly to have you have a look at the live briefing from the National Academy of Sciences. Have a good day, and hope you'll join us tomorrow, Friday, March 26th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for this follow-up discussion, which should be engaging and interesting, and hopefully include your questions and comments. So thank you again.